Hello everyone, Dr. Shabazz here, and I'm going to be covering Chapter 9 today. This is going to be an asynchronous lecture, so we are not meeting on Zoom. Tomorrow, you will view this video on your own time, particularly during that time slot. I will ask you to check in so that I know that you have seen the post. And that is also a way for me to record attendance. Today I will talk about global market entry strategies, licensing, investment, and strategic alliances. This chapter, as you will note, is, in my opinion, treated very lightly. And I believe it's a very interesting subject because the question is, how do you get your products from point A to point B? And it seems very simple because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. We all know that. But in trade, and when you're importing and exporting, we talked about that in the last chapter, there are lots of barriers to trade. There are your tariff barriers, there are your non-tariff barriers. So you can't always go from point A to point B without a lot of obstacles. And so there are some ways in which you can get into a foreign market, and this chapter covers those methods. I want to begin talking about some of the examples in this subject. And we have actually dealt with these subjects during class. We understand Theodore Levitt when he talks about globalization and he talks about markets becoming standard. And this is as a result of companies looking at markets abroad and coming up with a value proposition that we're offering quality products at a low price. So this, according to Levitt, seems to be a universal theme in terms of consumer behavior. Of course, there's a counter argument in terms of how people look at a value proposition. Is this suited for me? Is it customized? Does it have exactly what it is that I would like to have in a product? And so there's this ongoing debate between standardization versus customization. We also looked at some other cases. We did look at Hershey's and Hershey's activity in terms of expanding in China, Brazil, and Mexico. Each market had different challenges. And certainly in the confectionery business, it's indeed challenging because you have a situation, as we saw in China, where chocolate is not really one of the main fares of the Chinese market as of this time. And they're more of the high end where they have these very exquisite chocolates. And it is not the same type of perception that we have of chocolate, which is very widespread here and very much a part of the consumer diet here. We also saw Brazil, the expansion into Brazil. We saw that there was a lot of optimism in Brazil in terms of the uptick in the consumption of chocolate. On the other hand, in Mexico, we saw a different trend. We saw a decrease in chocolate for various reasons, some of it having to do with the reduction in the production of chocolate. And thus, it makes the chocolate more expensive. And then you have price elasticity. Prices are higher, then the consumption of chocolate is lower. So we looked at that case. We just looked at the Best Frozen Foods company in Germany, where they were trying to enter the market for frozen foods. I did post a number of links showing that the actual frozen food market has increased in Germany over the years, but not frozen corn. Frozen corn, there's still this stigma. I suppose people are still perceiving it to be for animals. And so they haven't gotten over that barrier yet, that cultural barrier. I want to talk about the case of Japan. Now, this is not in the book, and it may be in some other textbooks, but I just want to talk to you a little bit about Japan. Now, you know that Japan was in World War II. It was part of the Axis powers, along with Germany and Italy. And the war ended, World War II ended in 1945 after 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, destroying those 2 cities and essentially the economy of Japan. Tokyo was spared, but of course the supply chain is what it is, and Japan had to rebuild. And in the decades following the end of World War II, Japan embarked on a recovery that has not been matched since. They began to go abroad and research what other countries were doing. They were taking pictures of all types of innovations. They also imported intellectual capital. They got instruction from Deming, a quality control guru, and he was the one that kind of gave them an idea of this TQM and looking at the idea of quality management and ensuring that you have zero tolerance for error. And Japan took it to another level. So what happened after Japan began to recover? They started producing various products. Initially not very high quality, but then as they began to perfect this TQM, and then they instituted an idea of Keiretsu, which is these interlocking companies, they began to develop a competitive advantage in terms of production. So you fast forward and you go up into the 70s. So in the 70s, there was a momentous event, and this event created a world crisis. Not to the scale of the coronavirus, but it was a very serious disruption of the global economy. And it stemmed from a war that occurred in the Middle East between the Arab nations and Israel. And Israel was backed by the West, backed by the US, backed by Western Europe. And what the Arab nations decided to do, now the Arab, not just the Arab nations, but it was OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They decided that they were going to raise the price of petroleum. They were going to double the price. So if you look at this, here's an article talking about the oil embargo in 1973. And as we scroll down, we can see that it says during the OPEC oil embargo, inflation-adjusted oil prices went from $25.97 per barrel in 1973 to $46.35 per barrel in 1974. And you can see the graph here showing the fluctuation of the oil prices. And this was during the Nixon administration. So what happened after that was that the U.S. had to take action, because thousands of products are made out of oil. And I'll just show you another article that has a photo of all the cars wrapped around the block trying to get gas for their cars. There was a gas shortage because of the embargo. And this oil shock not only affected gas, but it affected the entire production cycle of U.S. factories. And so it became a big problem in terms of trying to fill in the gap. And it was around that time that the energy secretary started to consider, or the Department of Energy started to consider alternatives to gas. And so they started looking at solar power, and they started looking at ethanol and other types of substitutes for gas. They wanted to reduce the dependence on OPEC oil. So what happened leading up to this momentous event? Japan was already producing products, finished products. They were producing cars. These cars were very small. As you can imagine, in America at that time, people were driving large cars with leaded gas. They were essentially gas guzzlers, and they were not getting a lot of mileage. In fact, in one of the articles that I just pulled up, it was talking about the amount of gas that these cars were getting. And it was stating that these cars were getting 13 miles per gallon. Now, even by today's standards, that is very poor. Today, you have a lot of SUVs that are getting very poor gas mileage. So these cars getting 13 miles a gallon, 13 and a half miles per gallon, the U.S. automakers were under a lot of pressure. What was happening at this time was Japan was waiting in the wings with these small cars. And they decided that we're going to offer an alternative to these gas guzzlers in a time of crisis. So these Japanese cars started to come in to the United States. People started buying them because they were more fuel efficient. In fact, my sister had one of those early cars, and it was called the Corona, just like the coronavirus, as a matter of fact. And she enjoyed that car. It was her first new car, as a matter of fact, and she enjoyed zipping around in that car, and it was just something that was a sight to behold because it was so good on gas. And so as people caught on to the Japanese cars, more people started to buy these fuel efficient cars. And so you had the Toyota, you had the Datsun at the time before it became Nissan, and you had the Toyota, Datsun, and Honda. You had those three Japanese car makers. And these cars were coming in, slowly gaining traction in the market. So before long, the big three looked up and they saw these cars being sold in volume. And they said, they were alarmed. They said, hey, we have to do something. These Japanese cars are taking market share. So they reacted, and they came up with some competition. They came up with smaller versions of their models. And these models were cars such as the Pinto, the Vega, the Chevette. They were also small, better on gas, but very poor quality. Essentially, they were throwaway cars. They didn't last very long. In fact, the Pinto had a flaw because the gas tank was in the back of the vehicle, which upon a rear-end collision would explode. And there were many lawsuits that resulted as an aftermath of those accidents. So that was a classic case. But what happened after that, after the Japanese had entered the market, was that the U.S. decided that they were going to impose a tariff on these Japanese imports to stop the flow of the cars from coming in. But by that time, it was too late. The cars had gained traction, and people said, I will pay extra. The tariff that will make the car more expensive. People were saying, I like the car, so I will buy the car because it is of better quality and it's more fuel efficient. That is not even the end of the story. The story goes that after these cars developed traction, Japan decided that they were going to compete in a different class. They were going to a luxury car market. So what did they do? They had spin-offs. So the Toyota came up with Lexus. The Datsun, at that time was the Nissan, came up with the Infiniti. And Honda came up with Acura. So these are kind of spin-off brands or sub-brands that appear to be different companies altogether, but they're all under these parent companies. And that was a very ingenious way to get into the market. And now if you look at the roads today, a lot of the cars are Asian made, whether they're from South Korea, whether they're from Japan, and they are of good quality. Now American car makers are catching up, but you still have that situation where the ratings for Japanese cars are very high in terms of consumer satisfaction. What are some other cases? And we'll take a break shortly. Starbucks in China. China being a tea drinking country, and you have this phenomena of coffee in China. And I can actually show you a very interesting development. If we're talking about China, I will show you this video. So this is China and Starbucks market entry into the huge market. Everybody's trying to get into China, so it's not a surprise. But the headline is intriguing. Starbucks has an eye-popping new China plan to open a store every 15 hours for 4 years. And they have a very huge cafe. And I'll play this in just a minute, but I want to scroll down and show you some of what they said. CEO Kevin Johnson said in an interview in Shanghai, the coffee giant laid out plans to compete with KFC in the race to become China's fastest growing foreign food chain by opening a new store every 15 hours through 2022. It plans to have 6,000 stores on the mainland, then compare it to a previous target of 5,000 by 2021. And that's all it'll let me see without a subscription. But I will play this video so you can just see what they have going on in China. So there you have the case of Starbucks in China, and you know it makes sense that they would try to tap that market. As I said before, everybody's trying to get into China, and when you have 1.4, I believe it's 1.4 billion people, that is a lot of cups of coffee to sell at a premium price. But I must say that you do have Starbucks that in recent years have begin to pull back on some of their expansion and have closed a number of stores. Even domestically, they've closed, I believe a couple of years ago, it was 150 stores around the country that they closed. One other example that comes to mind is Nestle's in Brazil. So here you have a case. This is out of New York Times, and the title is How Big Business Got Brazil Hooked on Junk Food. And it talks about how Nestle have used these vendors, as you can see walking across the screen, going into the outskirts, places that are perhaps in rural areas, and delivering snacks, essentially. And as I scroll down, you'll kind of see the impact where they talked about vendors delivering all types of snacks, Kit Kats, and pudding, and other types of foods. As you can see here, the vendors delivering these food items, Nestle food items. And it goes on to talk about the impact of nutrition and obesity. And they give this map. And also you have people giving testimonies here. And you can see people enjoying their snack foods. And that's a 3.5-minute video. You can actually watch that if you want to take a look. And here you have other families. And this is one of the vendors, actually. She's sitting in the chair over there at the top part of the photo. She is one of the vendors, and she has her children with her, and that's how she supports her family. So this is Nestle's market entry into Brazil. And of course you have McDonald's, who's also been very keen in market entry strategies. It's very fascinating. All right. So let me get to the chapter. I've talked enough about cases in terms of global market entry strategies, and I want to talk about the methods that they outline in the book, because it is certainly very important. You know, when you look at the different methods, there's always this idea of cost, of how do you get into a market, a foreign market. Well, you have to make some calculated decisions. We had the Best Frozen Foods Company case, and F.R. Rosen decided, because he had seen activity in Germany, he assumed that it would be a hit in Germany. And of course, he was prone to self-reference criterion, and he was seeing things that were not actually true. This is what we call anecdotal evidence. So until you do the research, the market research, the focus groups, the consumer panels, and all the things that you all suggested in your cases, you're not going to be sure that such a product will be able to gain market entry. Then in NEW Market found all of these different barriers, and now they're having to overcome these barriers. Now, some of the ways to get products into a foreign market are exporting, as you see on the graph, which has very low involvement. Because say, for example, you have a warehouse of products that you're not selling. It is very easy to pick those products that you're not selling, put them on a container, a cargo, and ship them to a buyer. Now, of course, there is a process involved. You have to find the buyer, and there are ways to use brokers to match up buyers and sellers. You can use merchants, but essentially, it's fairly easy to get rid of surplus inventory or to export products from point A to point B. The cost is relatively low and the involvement is relatively low. Then you go up to licensing. Licensing is the next level because here you're giving permission. So first you have exporting, and then you have licensing. Now, licensing is a contract. You're giving an entity in another country permission. And one of the most important forms of licensing is a franchise. And we all know franchises are very widespread around the globe. And you give them permission to use your patents, which in McDonald's case, it would be making French fries. There is a patented way to make French fries if you're a McDonald's franchise. And you go to Oak Brook, Illinois, and you learn how to make French fries the McDonald's way. There is a patent on how that process is performed, making French fries. So in a licensing agreement, you're giving permission for another company or another entity to use your patents, your trade secrets, your trademarks, your brand names, and all the things that you rightfully own. And there are also some foreign franchises that we may not have recognized, like Nando's, Jollibee, which is a Filipino fast food company that have locations here in the United States. So this is a very common way of getting your products into a foreign market, and it has a little bit more involvement. And partly because you have to take care in ensuring that your intellectual property is protected. What is to stop someone from producing a knockoff, as we saw in the earlier video that I showed in class, where you had all of these different knockoffs, people copying legitimately trademarked companies and spinning off as their own these various brands. And so that is kind of one of the hurdles that one has to face. The advantages to licensing provides additional profitability, essentially residual. It's a residual income because you're getting these fees as a right to use something that has already been created. It provides a method of circumventing tariffs, something that could even be intellectual property like software. It certainly can be a franchise, but it can be something else that is not tangible in the sense that say a cup of coffee, or let's say a package of goods would be. You have various benefits of licensing. The licensee has some latitude in terms of how they can adapt the products. For example, McDonald's, if you go to the McDonald's site, you'll see that all these various countries have some latitude on what type of McDonald's products they have on their menus. And the variety is absolutely amazing. If you ever go to their site and you see all of the different options that some of these McDonald's franchises have on their menu, you would be surprised. And you talk about certain countries selling rice and different toppings, McDonald's selling pizza in some places, and other types of side dishes that are more suitable for that demographic market. So there are some advantages into getting into that market. It allows you access to more consumers, obviously. Again, some of the disadvantages: limited market control. You have to supervise the licensee because, for example, if they put something on the menu that you didn't approve, you can suffer some brand erosion. And it might not bode well for you because you might not readily be able to police them, because now you're under the national jurisdiction. And if that country does not have laws in place, then you're just kind of at the whim of a government protection. Now, your trademarks, your copyrights are protected by international law, but when you're in that country, you have to, any disputes, you have to essentially go through the government and have to have that arbitration to avoid going through a lengthy legal battle. The agreements, going through some of these agreements may be short-lived. Licensee may become a competitor if they decide, okay, we want to discontinue our license. We've learned how to make this product. It can be another product that they have reverse engineered and decide to make for themselves. Licensee may exploit company resources. Again, learning the process of whatever product that is being licensed, they can then turn around and use the intellectual know-how to produce their own. And there you have contract manufacturing if you want to manufacture products. Another way that you can enter a market is through investment. Now, as you could imagine, this would be on a higher level. This would actually be the fourth level. So we have exporting, licensing, contract manufacturing, and we have investment. And this is, if you've heard of foreign direct investment, this is along the same lines because it involves partial or full ownership of operations outside the home country. And it may entail you having a joint venture, which means that you own a percentage of a company, and it is a new company between you and a foreign investor. So both of you get together and you form a new company. So I want to show you an example of a joint venture. And it is related to the car case that I shared with you earlier. And this was the case of NUMMI. It was a joint venture between Toyota and GM. And why did GM do this? Well, they were trying to catch up. I mentioned to you the attempts that many of the American car companies made in order to gain ground on the Japanese car companies. Well, this was a joint venture between Toyota and GM that actually ended in the 80s. And it says here that, well, this is after the closing of it. But it says here, in 1984, GM offered half ownership of the NUMMI plant to Toyota in exchange for technology, because the big three were losing tremendous market share to the Japanese car companies. Exchange for technology, as the asset had lost its value in part due to the recession. How many such assets lie in wait today? So here it also says the early history of NUMMI has been well documented but controversial. It was heralded either as GM's window into Toyota's secrets or as an example of what Labor Secretary-to-be Robert Reich in Harvard Business Review called the joint ventures with Japan that give away our future. So in this article, they talk about not how GM benefited, but how Toyota actually benefited, and gave them more of an insight as to how the American market worked for in terms of consumer behavior for cars. And that joint venture actually ended, I believe it was in '84 that it ended, if I'm not mistaken. But that was kind of an example of a company trying to gain some insight as to how technology works. That was GM trying to get insight, but it turns out that Toyota was the company that got the insight. Minority or equity stakes. So you have minority, majority, equity stakes, where a company buys a minority stake in a foreign entity. And part of the reason that you would do that is to gain access to their distribution channels and also their knowledge. They can tell you how that market works. And I just pointed out a case of NUMMI between Toyota and GM. You can gain you can reduce your learning curve. Or a majority stake means now I own the company. So there are a lot of American companies that have foreign ownership, American-born companies that now have foreign ownership, and some of the names will frankly surprise you, and I put some of those companies on a slide behind me. But it is really amazing, this whole idea of how you can gain a competitive advantage by buying companies, and that is indeed what foreign direct investment is. It doesn't always work, because sometimes you end up buying companies that have massive debt, that have an inefficient supply chain, that have all of these issues, legal issues. Maybe they have lawsuits pending, and you would of course have your lawyers vet that, but there might be underlying issues that may have been missed. And that is really the risk that you incur. There was another case that I remember reading in a magazine called Success, and it was a joint venture between an American businessman and a Russian. So he goes over to Russia and he finds a partner, and they go into business together, joint venture. I don't know the percentage, it might have been 50-50. But they were going along in this business, and the American was disappointed in the returns on the business. And the Russian offered to buy his half of the business, because he stated, I agree, this is not going the way we thought it would go. I'll buy your half of the business. Now again, this was the Americans' company that they brought over to Russia trying to gain entry into the market, and then they decided to find a partner to go in on a joint venture. That way they can gain access to the Russian market. So the American agreed to sell his half of the company. He sold it, and that Russian turned that business into a multi-million-dollar business, knowing all along the keys to success, but did not necessarily want to let the American on to what their ulterior motive was. Now that company belonged to the Russian, and that Russian received great benefits from that joint venture. So this is one of the most risky types of market entry strategies, and some of the examples that I pointed out give you both advantages and disadvantages. Gaining access to a market, but also there are some disadvantages, that you have to have some synergy, you have to have some type of understanding, and you also have to get over some of management differences. And of course, with joint ventures, there's obviously money that is invested, and so you are at some inherent risk. Lastly, you have, I do want to point out on this particular slide they talk about equity stake and examples of equity stake. In some countries, they limit the amount of equity stake that a foreign investor can have. They may say that if you buy a company, you can only, or if you invest in a company, you can only have a certain percentage stake, equity stake. And they may say that equity stake is 49% at the high end. That's the most that you can invest in a company in our country. They want it to be locally controlled, right? So they will place a limit on how much of a local company you can own. And you see in this example the some of the companies that have engaged in these equity stakes. And some of these are rather old now. You have more current examples, but these were some examples that were on the high end. So the last one is strategic alliances or strategic partnerships, collaborative agreements, global strategic partnerships. And we may know that companies often come together. They're competitors, but sometimes it's in their best interest to cooperate. If you took me for global business, you'll remember the case of the Banana Gate in Jamaica, where the U.S. government filed a complaint with the WTO on behalf of Dole, Chiquita, and Del Monte. And that case was to gain access to the European market. That market was closed to American bananas because the EU gave preferential treatment to African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And so the U.S. filed a complaint with the WTO on behalf of these three companies, and they ultimately won, believe it or not. Those three companies controlled 95% of the world banana market, and they were looking to compete for the other 5%. And so that was a case where these three companies developed an alliance in terms of a legal case in order to gain more access to markets abroad. So here's an idea. You have a strategic alliance is essentially a partnership, which means these companies are still independent. They're competitors, but they're still independent. There are shared benefits. And sometimes, for example, you may have situations where companies may get together and they may lobby against a supplier who are making parts. And because the idea is if you place a large order for parts, then you'll get a cheaper price. So sometimes you have companies going in on an order just so they can get a cheaper per unit cost. But of course, it's not a joint venture in a sense that you have a joint company. It's just an alliance. And then after that objective has been reached, then you go your separate ways. So you have you have a sliding scale in terms of the cooperation that you give as far as what you're trying to achieve, how long that strategic alliance will be in terms of the ongoing contributions that are being made, the level of independence, and also the shared benefits that each party will get. There are some challenges that are mentioned with entering the Asian market. Because you have a different level of competition there, most notably the Keiretsu. These are interlocking companies that, or a family of companies that engage in relationships that essentially encompass the entire supply chain. These companies collaborate, they cooperate, and they may even block foreign competition. by ensuring that the supply chain is sewn up, so to speak. In the book, they give a case of a company that wanted to buy a supercomputer. I believe it was Nissan. And so Cray put in the bid. Hitachi also put in the bid. The interesting thing here is that Hitachi did not make supercomputers. And so they pressured Nissan Keiretsu to accept the bid because they had a similar they had a relationship with one of the Keiretsu companies. So because of the family relationship, they said, dude, you should pick us. Even though we don't produce supercomputers, maybe we can produce one. Maybe we can put some designs together and produce a supercomputer. So what happened was the American lobby groups got together and they applied pressure. Probably the Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce, the ambassadors, the consul generals all got together and they applied pressure to Japan to not have this type of competitive discrimination. And Cray ended up getting the contract eventually. But that just shows the barriers to market entry. So what I'd like to do now is show a video. This video is of two consumer goods companies, Coke and Pepsi, and it shows how they entered various markets. And I think you'll be intrigued. Although the video is a classic video, it shows how these companies entered. And the case of Pepsi is very interesting because it was a case of them entering the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. And I want you to see exactly how that was done. It was pioneered by John Kendall, who is highly regarded for being able to enter the Soviet Union when the Iron Curtain was still raised. And so I think it represents a classic case. So we'll watch that video, and it is about 17 minutes, and so that will take us to the end of this class. Hopefully you have gotten something out of this lecture. Market entry is a very fascinating subject, also very challenging because there are a number of barriers to overcome. This is a video presentation titled Takes Two, Coke and Pepsi, a video showing the market entry strategies of both of the soft drink giants and showing their various strategies and how they adapted their promotion, their products, and particularly in the Pepsi case, how they entered a brand new market. In that time, the Soviet Union was a very difficult market for American companies to enter because of political reasons. But we see in this video an example of how that was done by Donald Kendall, who was actually the one credited with entering or helping Pepsi to enter the market. Certainly the lessons are decades old, but the lessons are still very relevant. And many of the techniques that are used or that were used then can also apply today.
Until recently, many Americans had not really thought of the rest of the world as their marketplace. Perhaps this could be expected because of the traditional importance and size of the United States. However, while we were looking at our domestic market, so was the rest of the world. Business competitors from around the globe targeted our relatively free and wealthy market. And American businesses found themselves facing foreign competitors, especially from Western Europe and Japan. Such competitors as Mercedes from Germany, Shell from Holland, and Sony from Japan. And recently, the globalization of the marketplace has accelerated due to advancements in telecommunications and transportation. We must respond to these competitive threats by seeing and seizing the opportunities in the world market. As we look to the global marketplace, we will notice that by 1997, consumers in 12 countries have higher incomes than we do. When we think of the U.S. as having only 5% of the world's consumers, we can see the other 95% of the world's population as an immense opportunity. Many U.S. firms are already in the world market. For instance, McDonald's is a successful American company which has been able to see and seize opportunities in Europe and Asia as well as the former Soviet Union. The question marketing managers must ask is, what, if anything, do we have to do differently to market goods and services internationally? First, because there are more than 175 different countries, and most firms have limited resources, we have to start with a global market assessment to match firm and product strengths with market opportunities in order to target markets with the best prospects. Next, we have to develop an understanding of which aspects of the 4 Ps can be standardized across countries and which have to be adapted for some or all countries. In domestic marketing, we tend to focus on managing the 4 Ps, product, price, place, and promotion, with less consideration of environmental variables because these are similar for our home market. However, in international markets, the differences in the political, economic, or cultural variables from country to country may require marketing managers to adapt some or all of the marketing mix. Observe how 2 familiar and successful U.S. corporations have responded differently to this issue of global standardization versus cross-national adaptation. Coca-Cola is an example of a truly global company. Coca-Cola leads in soft drink sales around the world. It outsells its closest competitor, Pepsi-Cola, by more than 3-to-1 outside the United States. For example, consumers in the United Kingdom, France, and Germany have made Coke their most frequently purchased soft drink. Since Coke enjoys global appeal, it lends itself to a standardized global marketing strategy. For instance, Coke's secret formula is used globally, and its theme, "Can't Beat the Feeling," is now a familiar theme in many countries. While Coke is sold in most countries with few changes in its packaging, government legislation in Taiwan and Korea require the company to use the national language on all Coke products. The image in Coke's ads varies between markets. For instance, Coke uses a strategy in some countries which promotes the product as an all-occasion drink to be shared among friends and family.
Rien ne résiste. Avec un hamburger, tu vas te régaler. Tu l'aimes avec un hot dog, essaye avec un steak, un plat de spaghetti pour un bon déjeuner. À toi d'en profiter, un Coke va te donner une vraie sensation. Cette sensation s'appelle Coke.
In others, Coke uses a different appeal.
吧，喝一口，情人能够味，挡不住的感觉。
Sometimes Coke uses popular teen idols from the foreign country to promote its products in that country.
Coca-Cola, es el ritmo que se siente, ven y baila con mi gente. Muy suavecito, con Coca-Cola. Vive la sensación. Pégale. Ahí. Me gusta en la noche, me gusta en la playa, me gusta en la lluvia, sabor de Coca-Cola. Me gusta su textura, me gusta por su estilo, mi sed desaparece, sabor de Coca-Cola. Sensación sin igual, el sabor de Coca-Cola. Sensación sin igual, el sabor de Coca-Cola. Sensación sin igual.
The Spanish TV ad features Angel Faria, while the second ad, recently shown in Guatemala, features a Latin American star. Coke uses a very different approach in Thailand. Rather than stressing the familiar themes from other countries, their ad shows young people dreaming about a modern future for Thailand and themselves. The message at the end of the ad means, "From our heart, Coca-Cola for Thailand." Japan is also a major market for Coke. The company now has 70% of the Japanese cola market with its flagship brand and 20% for Coca-Cola Light. Initially, Diet Coke did not sell well in Japan. Japanese women do not want to drink anything clearly labeled as a diet product. Sales finally took off after Diet Coke was reformulated and repositioned as Coke Light.
Soltanto una caloria, ce n'è solo una che non potete lasciare. Diet Coke.
Dove siete? È stato eliminato dal volo.
Contrary to what some people may think, American culture is very popular with young people in Japan.
Hi.
Hi.
What can I get for you?
Full Coca-Cola.
Oh, okay, sure.
そこには冷たいコカ・コーラが待っていた。刺激がはじけた。コカ・コーラが美味しい。みんなの心が溶け合った。爽やかになるひととき。
In this ad, Coke offers its cola as a link between Japanese youth and popular American culture. Many firms, such as Coca-Cola's closest competitor, PepsiCo Incorporated, choose to form strategic alliances such as joint ventures in international markets. They form these alliances with foreign nationals in order to gain local experience to deal with different legal, political, economic, and cultural environments. While Coke has much higher sales than Pepsi globally, the situation is reversed in Russia, where Pepsi has such an alliance.
1959, the Moscow Trade Fair. Soviet citizens have their first taste of Pepsi-Cola, a soft drink from the USA. Among them, Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who finds Pepsi most refreshing. Donald M. Kendall, then Pepsi-Cola International president, knew this event represented something larger. For the next 14 years, he dedicated himself to establishing a new kind of bond between the Soviet and American people. And in 1973, the world press announces a unique breakthrough in international cooperation. Pepsi-Cola and the Soviet Union sign an historic counter-trade agreement. It opens the huge American consumer market to Soviet vodka exports and establishes the first production and sales of an American consumer product in the Soviet Union. From the start, the Soviet-Pepsi partnership has been dedicated to quality and technological innovation. Pepsi helped Soviet bottling plants arrange financing for the latest equipment to expand production quality and quantity. Pepsi helps us with quality control. And we don't let down the Pepsi trademark. Pepsi product development experts and their Soviet partners are creating a full line of new soft drinks to meet consumer demand. Pepsi's lemon soda, Fiesta, developed specifically for Soviet bottlers, has become immensely popular with the Soviet public. Soviet bottlers have begun producing tonics, a new orange-flavored soft drink with Soviet-grown white grape juice as a key ingredient. And Diet Pepsi marks the Soviet Union's first production of a sugar-free soft drink. And Pepsi pioneered entertaining commercials on Soviet television.
Новое поколение выбирает Pepsi.
Pepsi has been very flexible and has helped us with the problem of the non-convertible ruble. They worked with us to find products to export from the Soviet Union. And they helped us build Pepsi production in the Soviet Union by exporting vodka to the United States. The Pepsi-Soviet partnership is a counter-trade agreement which protects Soviet hard currency reserves. Pepsi-Cola is imported as a concentrate for manufacturing into soft drinks by Soviet plants. And concentrate is counter-traded for Stolichnaya vodka, the first Soviet consumer product ever sold in the United States. And in the United States, where Stolichnaya is more commonly known as Stoli, consumer response to Soviet vodka has been excellent. Donald M. Kendall, the man who brought Pepsi to the Soviet Union.
Well, the one thing about the Soviets, which I think a lot of people don't understand, is that, first of all, when you're negotiating with them, they do their homework. So you better make sure that you do your homework and know what you're talking about and what you want to do. The other thing that you'll find with the Soviets is that they're extremely loyal to companies and people that they deal with. If you establish a long-term relationship with the Soviets, they live up to those agreements and contracts. In fact, there have been periods where we've operated in the Soviet Union where we had no written agreement.
Today, PepsiCo has 85 joint ventures scattered throughout the former Soviet Union and other communist and formerly communist countries.
And it is also a global company, rooted in the Pepsi-Cola international family. Pepsi's local partners in 150 nations.
We have seen that one key to success in international marketing is to understand that environmental variables may interact with the marketing mix differently from country to country. thus requiring some adaptation. Conversely, in some markets or with some products, similarities may overshadow local differences, allowing for standardization. For instance, Coca-Cola is able to use its secret formula in almost every country, leading to economies of scale. With more than 175 countries in the world, we cannot know in advance about all of these environmental variables and how they will interact with the 4 Ps in each market. But based on the experiences of Coke and Pepsi, we see that marketing managers have to be sensitive to the important political, economic, cultural, or other environmental differences affecting the marketing mix. Discovering the similarities and differences of people and nations around the world makes international marketing a most interesting and rewarding career. If you're willing and able to grasp the complexities of the global marketplace, you'll be able to help your firm grow, create jobs, and make money and friends around the world.